So where do we stand now? The blockade of Gaza continues. Israel still makes it nearly impossible for construction and building material to enter Gaza. According to the United Nations, at the present rate, it would take 75 years to bring in the materials needed to rebuild Gaza. Israel also prohibits exports from Gaza, making it nearly impossible to restore Gaza's economy. Oxfam, the humanitarian organization, it said, "What Gaza needs now most are jobs, raw materials for reconstruction and for industry, and the ability to export, not just short-term aid and consumer products like jam that without a job, Gazans can't afford." Nonetheless, we would be short-sighted, we would be remiss if we in any way underrated the significance of the achievement of the people on the Mavi Marmara, the nonviolent international grassroots initiative that proved able to force the hand of the world's mightiest powers. That last phase of the blockade of Gaza, that flagrant violation of international law that was destroying a civilization, it began in June 2007. And for 3 years, there wasn't a peep from the international community, not a word of dissent. And then suddenly, after the martyrdom of the 9 passengers on the Mavi Marmara, suddenly all the world's leaders awakened. And singly and in unison, they all start to use the same word. The Israeli siege of Gaza is unsustainable. The blockade has to be lifted. For 3 years, not a word. And now they suddenly discovered the blockade of Gaza was unsustainable and had to be lifted. The prison gates of Gaza have been pried open only a few inches. But those inches, they show the latent power of a movement built on the simple truth that the occupation is inhuman and unjust. If the people in the Mavi Marmara showed what we can and should do, then the people in Washington, Tel Aviv, and regrettably also Ramallah show us what we shouldn't do. Our resources are scarce, our time is scarce. We shouldn't waste our time, we shouldn't squander our energy on this meaningless sideshow, this contemptible, meaningless sideshow called the peace process. There never was a peace process, there isn't a peace process, and for the foreseeable future, there won't be one. That's not just rhetoric. That's what a rational person concludes looking at the record. A rational person, he or she judges not by words, but by outcomes. So, we have sitting in the 3rd row a man, what's your name, sir? Gordon. Don't worry, the cameras are pointed in my direction, you're safe. So, Gordon has a grandson, we'll call him Johnny. And little Johnny, he's 5 years old. He goes over to Grandpa Gordon. For those of you who are Arab speakers, we'll call him Baba. And he goes over to Baba, Grandpa Gordon, and he says, "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up." Gordon surges with pride. That chip off the old block, my grandson, Johnny, he's going to be a doctor. Then Johnny, he starts grade school. Not terrific. Doesn't perform brilliantly in class. In fact, he's not going to class. The principal calls down Johnny to his office, calls in Baba, tells Baba that Johnny is not performing up to par. Johnny turns to Grandpa and says, "Grandpa, I'm going to be a doctor." Okay. Johnny goes to middle school. Johnny goes to high school. Johnny is cutting his classes. Johnny's a truant. Johnny's hanging out with the wrong kind of people. Johnny is robbing banks. Johnny is mugging old people. Johnny kills a couple in their bed at night. Johnny is hauled before the judge. Johnny is sentenced to life. Baba, and I can see from his face, he's very disappointed in the chip off his own body. Baba goes to see Johnny in jail, and Johnny says with his stupid grin, "I'm going to be a doctor." At this point, Grandpa gives him a smack and says, "You're probably not even my grandson." Now, some of you are wondering, what does that have to do with the peace process? And maybe Finkelstein, since he talked with or surged with pride about the 1960s, maybe he took a few too many mind-altering drugs of his own. But in fact, it has everything to do with the peace process. Because just like Johnny, we have now 17 years to look at the record. And let's see what happened. The so-called peace process is said to have begun in September 1993. The Oslo Accord, the famous handshake on the White House lawn. And for the past 17 years, there has been this thing we hear about every day, the peace process, the peace process. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a doctor. The peace process, the peace process. Well, let's look at the result. Let's look at the outcome. In September 1993, there were 250,000 illegal Jewish settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. 17 years later, there are 500,000. The number has doubled. According to the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories, Israel has now annexed 42% of the West Bank for the settlements. So judging by outcomes and not by words, judging by outcomes, there has not been a peace process, there has been an annexation process. The peace process is the facade behind which the annexation process unfolds. In fact, the annexation process needs the peace process, because whenever Israel is held to account, for example, for the illegal Jewish settlements, what does it say? It says the question of the settlements, it has to be negotiated in the peace process. And as the peace process unfolds interminably, behind it, the annexation process continues uninterrupted. But some of you say, but wait, maybe that was true in the past, but things have changed. Because there was a settlement freeze in the last phase of the peace process. And aren't we now debating whether or not the settlement freeze will be extended. But here's a question. How can you extend what never existed in the first place? There never was a settlement freeze. Sounds like rhetoric. Fair enough, until you look at the facts. The main Israeli organization responsible for monitoring the settlement growth is the Israeli organization Peace Now. And they put out monthly reports. They looked at that 10-month period where all of you, or we all, were hearing about Mr. Netanyahu's settlement freeze. They looked at that 10-month period, and here's what they concluded. On the ground, there is almost no freeze or even a visible slowdown. Settlement freeze, it was a fiction right from the outset. It was a fiction right from the outset. Does that mean we were all tricked, fooled? It was all a scam? Actually, it was quite clever what happened. Because if you looked at the terms of the agreement, it was a freeze on new construction. A freeze on new construction. So what happened? 6 months before Mr. Netanyahu announced the settlement freeze, 6 months before, he met with the settler leaders and he said, all you have to do is lay the foundations for new homes. Then I'll announce the settlement freeze and you can continue to build the homes because it's not new construction. It's construction that began before the settlement freeze was announced. And so the number of homes that went up was just about the same number as before the freeze was announced. Does that mean that Mr. Netanyahu gets no credit? No. We have to be fair. He has significant achievements to his name. And Peace Now described one. Referring to the settlement freeze, Peace Now said, Mr. Netanyahu will probably not win the Nobel Peace Prize, but he is certainly likely to win the Nobel Prize for physics or at least chemistry. Why? Because he has discovered that contrary to what scientists had thought until now, water is not the only substance that expands instead of contracting when it freezes.